Hi everybody, I'm Tim from troutandfeather.com, and thanks for viewing this YouTube fly tying tutorial on a fly that I should have featured on this channel a long time ago, the Light Cahill. This is easily one of my favorite dry flies of all time. Aside from the fact that it was the first fly I was ever hooked with, thanks Dad, the Light Cahill was just a go-to fly in my box that I would just turn to on a regular basis. I knew very little about entomology whenever I first got into fly fishing, but what I did know was that anytime I saw a light-colored mayfly come off the water, I could put on a Light Cahill and have success with it. Now the Light Cahill that I'm talking about is that of the Catskill style. We're talking about flies that have very stiff tail fibers that can really do a great job of supporting the back of the fly, tightly dubbed bodies, hackle with probably an extra wind or two that really represented way more than the required 6 insect legs, and then finally a very prominent wing. The wing material on the Light Cahill was one of those two that I really just held in the highest of esteem. Because whenever I first got started into dry fly tying, there were two materials that were just almost magical to me. One was Hackle, and two, wood duck flank. This stuff was just like gold to me. All the fly tyers just always talked about this stuff and how precious it was. In fact, I never wanted to use mine. I spent so many hours dyeing mallard flank in tea because I just really didn't want to give up all of my wood duck flank. Fortunately, I have an absolute wonderful supplier for my wood duck flank now. Kirk, if you're watching, keep going after those woodies for me, and I owe you a dozen Light Cahills. And I use my wood duck flank because it is just an absolute gorgeous material. And it's one of those just two early go-to materials that were always on my bench. Now it's odd how in the last 25 years those materials have changed. If you tie dry flies, the two materials on your bench now are probably CDC and snowshoe rabbit. I know they're on mine, but I haven't forgot about the Hackle, nor have I forgotten about that wood duck flank. Now a couple other shifts have occurred in dry fly fishing. The most prominent being that turn that we made towards those water wisp flies and then eventually parachutes. They really just revolutionized dry fly fishing in the United States and really just made us turn a corner. Now not everyone turned that corner completely, myself included, because I still have a very special and prominent spot in my dry fly box for the Catskill style fly. And there's a really good reason why. For starters, I really love to fish Light Cahills in faster currents. I'm talking pocket water and riffles, where the fish have just a split second to make a decision. But more importantly, I want to fish them in locations where I have to pick up the fly very quick with my eyes. Because they float so well in the water, it's a pattern that I can cast out there in a size 16, pick it up quickly with my eyes, and have visual contact with it the entire float. That's something that to me is very critical. When I fish this pattern, I typically will fish it on an 8-foot and 11-foot leader, including the tippet, and I never go any smaller than 5X. I've caught a lot of very large fish on 4X with a size 14 Light Cahill, and I really encourage you to try it in some riffles and in some pocket water. I don't know too much about the history of the Light Cahill. I've read a couple articles from Mike Valla, and I've done a little bit of research on it, and I can tell you that Mr. Daniel Cahill was the originator of this pattern. Now, whenever he first created it, it was a dark body. I believe it was muskrat. And boy, has that really just changed over the last 100 years or so. In fact, if you do a Google search of the Light Cahill, you'll find just tons of different variations for the tail, for the body, and for the hackle. Just so many color combinations out there. But for the most part, they're all lighter shades, as will mine be today. Well, with all of that said, I do want to get into the actual tying of this really just prominent and traditional dry fly. First, I'm going to show you a finished picture of the Light Cahill. I'll list all the tying materials I'll be using in this video. And then finally, I will go through the tying procedures for, again, one of my favorite dry flies of all time, the Light Cahill. In my Stonfo Cayman Vise, I have a hook from Allen Fly Fishing. This is their D101BL. The BL stands for barbless. This is also a dry fly hook, and I'll tie the Light Cahill anywhere between the sizes of size 10 the whole way down to a size 18. My thread is Unithread size 8/0. The color is, obviously, Light Cahill. I like to start the thread directly behind the eye. Get a few locking wraps, and then I'm going to immediately place my wing on. For the wing, I like to just first gather my material and get all the tips together. So I simply just went straight up, gather them all together. Then I'm just going to pinch those with my right hand and see which ones are just kind of going all over about the sides. I want to get those ones out of there for now. Once I've done that, I can then just let go, re-grip these, pull the great fibers forward, rolling them in my fingers until I have all the fibers that I want directly up by the hook. Now at this point I want to measure them. I want them to be approximately the distance from the front of the hook eye to about right here, directly before that bend. If you go a little bit longer, that's fine, but I really don't like them to stretch the whole way from the eye to the bend. I think that's just a hair long for this traditional pattern. Once I have them, I put my initial locking wrap in. Ensure they're the correct length. Once I am sure of that, I can just wrap a little bit more firm as I go back towards the tail of the hook. Trim those off. Go through the butt fibers. And then now we're at the point where I want to place these wings in my V fashion. My first step is really just to take my fingernail and give them a nice little poke up. You'll see they'll rise rather quickly. Next I'm going to take my left hand, pull them all back, and then wrap rather aggressively in front of them. I basically want to build up just a little pocket so I can ensure that they're going to be riding high. Next I'm going to wet my fingers and then just get those a little wet as well. They're a little bit easier to manipulate once they have just a little bit of water on them, and I want to separate them. So it's even on both sides. Once I get them to a pretty nice point, I'm just going to make a couple figure-8 wraps to do an initial separation. There's one wrap. And there's my second. Now I can examine them to make sure that there's approximately the same numbers on both sides. Once I'm happy with that, I can then leave it as is, or I can place kind of like a parachute wrap. I call it almost a helicopter style wrap around each post. That's what I'm going to do. And I just call those a post. I really didn't mean to say that. Think of it as the wing, but to me they look kind of like parachute posts. So that's what I guess I'll accidentally refer to them as. Alright, there's 2 around that wing facing you. And there's the same on the wing on my side. Now I'll show you how those are just splayed nicely. I do prefer to prop them up just a little bit more, but I can do that a little bit better once I get the rest of my materials in. For the tail, they typically will recommend that you use fibers that come off of a longer hackle. Being that we live in the 21st century, we have these wonderful microfivets. Now maybe that takes away from this traditional pattern. However, these things are just super straight. They have great tips, and they really will help to float this fly. I probably go a little bit excessive when it comes to this pattern and some of the materials. I'm going to pull anywhere between 5 to 6 of these, pinch them together in a clump, and then trim. For placement, I'm looking for them to be approximately the length of that body, which is going to go from above where the barb would be to the hook point, and then add just a little bit more. Add approximately another 1/4. I'll transfer into my left hand, and at this point I can actually keep my left hand at that bend, place the excess butt fibers so they're sloping down. They're at I guess if we would call it, this is a 0 degree, they're going down around 15 to 20 degrees, somewhere in that range. And then with that said, I can just pull my thread and it will automatically just pull those right around and they'll be laying flat on the hook shank. Now that could be a little bit difficult for a beginning fly tyer. So if you are at the point where you have them measured about where you want them to be, but your left hand is just a little too far back, you can just simply pinch with your right, move it to the point where you want, and then you can apply the pinch method so you know you're not going to lose any of the tension of the thread. At that point, we're going to wrap back. We're going to get directly above where that barb would be. And I just want to put one little wrap underneath them. I want them splaying just a little bit. I don't want them going directly straight back, though that is a little bit more traditional to do that. I want them splayed just a hair and with just a short angle upwards. Okay, we got the butt fibers out of there. Next, it's time to apply our dubbing, and I do have my original dubbing from my first pack of Light Cahill. I bought this from an Orvis store. It's their fine and dry dubbing. Doesn't look like I used a lot out of this, but it really was a clumpy pack, trust me. I no longer use this fine and dry dubbing. There's just a little bit of an antron material in there, and I really prefer natural versus the synthetic with dry flies. I've since switched to a few different ones, and currently I'm using this this dubbing by the Delaware River Club. It's pale yellow, represents a variety of patterns. It's nice because they give you some Latin names as well, and it just has a really nice pale yellow to it. There is a downside to this. It is natural dubbing, but as you can see, it has some longer fibers. Some of those are more like guard hairs, and I have to pick those out before I finish the fly. So keep that in mind if you buy any of this stuff off of them. The great thing about it, though, is that it dubs really tight. Okay, now I'm going to just leave my thread wraps, just a couple wraps behind my wings. And next I want to finalize everything with my hackle. I've already selected a cream hackle. You can see it's a little tilted one way or another because I was just measuring it against my hook shank. The one thing I want to point out is that you can see it's relatively the same width until we get closer to the bottom. And then it really just starts to splay outwards and it really increases in width. So it's at that point that I really don't want to be using those long fibers. It's really kind of easy to see. If you look inside, you can see that there's almost this pattern that's going on inside the hackle. And right where that starts to really get excessively wide is where I'm just going to pull the fibers down and get them out of there. I don't want those part of my fly whatsoever. So I'm just going to remove them with my thumbnail. Next, I'm going to trim up both sides of this hackle so I can create almost a latching point. So you can see I just trimmed up those stems a little bit, and there's just a little bit excess fiber on there that I can just latch onto. And then finally I'm just going to pull a few fibers off of one side so that when I wrap, those fibers aren't initiating anything and causing other fibers to go awry. This is the front of the feather, and I want to make that so that shiny part is facing forward on this fly. Stem went flying. I'm going to try to place approximately 3 wraps behind my wings and 3 wraps in front. You'll notice if you want to call me out on this, you're more than welcome to. I definitely over wing this pattern and over hackle this pattern and probably over tail this pattern. As I mentioned earlier, I like to fish this in really fast water, thus I dress it accordingly. Whenever I'm applying the hackle, I'm going to use my Stonfo hackle pliers. I've used these in so many of my videos. I've recommended these to so many tires that I really just like them as well. They just really do a great job of holding on to the hackle, which is the primary function of hackle pliers. I can see I'm catching some of those wood duck fibers. I don't want to catch those yet. If I catch one or two, that's not too bad. And I got 3 behind. Now as I move forward, I really want to make sure that if there's any fibers that are leaning forward, I don't catch them. So I'm just going to kind of jigsaw this back and forth. Just wiggle it back and forth so I'm not catching any of those other fibers. 1, 2, 3. I think I could probably squeeze one more in there. These fibers are getting a little short at the front. I might do the same thing with my thread, just kind of wiggle it back and forth so I don't catch all those hackle fibers and just get them trapped in an awkward position. I have the tip out of there. Now I can just examine my fly before I finish it. There's a few fibers just kind of jutting forward. I'd love to say those are going to represent the antenna, but I am going to get those out of there. I'm just going to pinch them back. And then I'll wrap in front. I don't want to place too many wraps in there because I really don't want to crowd that head. At this point I can just immediately go right into my whip finish. I want to keep it as close to that head as possible. And that is it for our Light Cahill. If we take a look at the finished fly, we have that real nice long extended tail. If you take a look at that body, that was that real nice dubbing I used. There might be a few fibers that are sticking out. I can just see a couple, and I will just grab a pair of hackle pliers, get those out of there. Are they going to impact the fishing performance? Absolutely not. That's more about, I guess, impressing your buddies than attempting to catch those fish. Then we see the hackle as we move forward. It definitely extends below the point of the hook, probably just a hair too much, but as I mentioned before, I really definitely will over hackle these flies. That's something that I do intentionally, and you really don't have to do that, but in my mind I know how I'm going to be fishing these. It's going to be in fast water, and I really want to see these things on top of that water, and I really need them floating. Finally, the most important part is probably those wood duck wings, in my opinion. I really love seeing that prominent V with those wings. I think they show up wonderfully, and most importantly, they are just absolutely beautiful. So with all that said, I'll try to prop this guy up. He's resting pretty nice, and there is a finished look at my Light Cahill. Well, thanks go out to all of you for viewing this YouTube fly tying tutorial. If you'd like to view more of my fly tying tutorials, you can do so on this YouTube channel or on my website, which is www.troutandfeather.com. You can also find me on Facebook. Just look for my name. It's Tim Cammisa or Trout and Feather. And finally, I'd like to thank Allen Fly Fishing for the use of their D101BL dry fly hook. It's an excellent hook. I've used it in a lot of these videos, and I definitely encourage you to try it out as well. Well, once again, thanks for viewing this YouTube fly tying tutorial, one of my favorite dry flies out there. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them directly on this YouTube page, or as always, you can email me at tcammisa@gmail.com. Thanks everyone, and I hope you enjoy tying and fishing this great fly.